What types of bad parenting do kids not recover from? My therapist once asked me what my earliest memory was. I told her it was my 5th birthday, watching my mother measure out exactly 3 bites of cake on my plate, while my skinny brother Ethan got a normal slice. She weighed me every morning before breakfast, and if I'd gained even half a pound, breakfast became a glass of water with lemon. "Nobody loves a fat girl," she'd say, pinching my stomach. "I'm doing this because I love you." By age 7, I knew the calorie count of every food in our house. By 9, I was sneaking to the bathroom after meals. Not to throw up yet, that came later, but to cry over the hunger pains. My mother would beam when people commented on what a delicate little girl I was. "She takes after me," she'd lie. My mother was naturally thin. I had my father's build, sturdy and athletic, which she considered a personal betrayal. The food stuff was just the beginning. She had this way of making everything about my body feel wrong. When I got my period at 11, she acted disgusted, threw a box of pads at me, and said I was becoming one of those women too early. When I needed my first bra, she made me try on dozens in the middle of the store, loudly announcing to the sales clerk that we needed to minimize the situation. But here's what really destroyed me: the comparison game. My mother had a best friend, Rita, with a daughter named Jasmine, who was everything my mother wanted in a child. Blonde, thin, quiet. Every week we'd have dinner with them, and my mother would spend the entire meal talking about Jasmine's achievements while I sat there. Jasmine got into advanced ballet. Of course she has the body for it. Or, Jasmine's wearing size 0 jeans now. Isn't that wonderful? One night when I was 13, I overheard my mother on the phone with Rita. "I love her because I have to," she was saying about me. "But I don't like her. How could I? Look at her. She's nothing like what I imagined having a daughter would be." I stopped eating completely after that. For 3 weeks, I survived on ice chips and diet soda. When I finally collapsed during gym class, the school counselor called my parents in. My mother's response? She was embarrassed that I'd made such a scene. "If you wanted attention, you could have just asked," she said in the car. My dad tried to help in his own broken way. He'd sneak me food when mother wasn't looking, but he'd also say things like, "Just try to make her happy," or, "You know how she is." He knew it was wrong, but he was too weak to stop it. That might have been worse than if he'd been actively cruel. At least then I could have hated them both cleanly. When I turned 16, something shifted. I'd been in therapy secretly, using the money I made from tutoring. My therapist had been working with me on understanding that my mother's voice in my head wasn't actually mine. One day, my mother started her usual routine at dinner, comparing my thighs to Jasmine's, and I just stopped caring. I looked at her and said, "I'm not Jasmine. I'm never going to be Jasmine, and that's okay with me." She slapped me, hard, in front of my father and brother. My father didn't even look up from his plate. Ethan actually smirked. That's when I knew I was completely alone in that house. I started planning my escape that night, got a job at a bookstore, saved every penny, applied to colleges across the country, forged my mother's signature on the applications because she refused to support me going anywhere. "Why waste money on college when you'll just get pregnant and quit?" she'd said. The acceptance letter from Oregon State came on a Tuesday. Full ride scholarship for academic excellence. I'd hidden my grades from my mother for years, letting her believe I was average. I packed that night, taking only what I could fit in 2 bags. I left a note that said simply, "I choose myself." But here's the thing about that kind of damage. You can leave the house, but you can't leave what it did to you. I'm 23 now, and I still can't eat in front of people without feeling judged. I weigh myself obsessively. When someone compliments me, I assume they're lying. Last week, my mother called for the first time in 2 years, but it wasn't about Jasmine this time. She was crying, begging me to come home. "Your father left me," she sobbed. "And Ethan. Something happened with Ethan." I hung up. Then she sent a photo that made my blood run cold. It was Ethan, but he looked skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely recognizable. The text said, "He's been copying everything you did. The not eating. He weighs 89 pounds. Please come home." My therapist says going back would undo years of progress, but the photo haunts me. My little brother, the golden child, destroying himself the same way I did. And my mother, finally alone with the consequences of what she created, begging for help from the daughter she never wanted. Tomorrow I have to decide whether to go back, or let them drown in the dysfunction they created. I couldn't sleep that night and kept pulling up Ethan's photo on my phone every few minutes. His cheeks looked sunken in like someone had scooped them out with a spoon. The dark circles under his eyes went all the way down to his jaw. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I zoomed in on his collarbones that stuck out like coat hangers. I got up and walked to the kitchen for water, but ended up just standing at the counter staring at nothing. The clock on the microwave said 1:47 a.m. and I knew I wasn't going to sleep at all. My therapist's words kept playing in my head about how going back would undo everything I'd worked for. But Ethan's face in that photo looked exactly like mine had when I was at my worst. At 2 a.m., I grabbed my phone and called my therapist's emergency line because my chest felt too tight to breathe. She picked up on the 3rd ring and I could barely get words out between the gasping. She talked me through the breathing exercises we'd practiced 100 times before. Count to 4 on the inhale and hold for 7 and release for 8. After 10 minutes, I could finally talk without feeling like I was drowning. She reminded me that helping Ethan didn't mean I had to move back or let my mother hurt me again. I I could set boundaries and still help my brother from a safe distance. We talked for another 20 minutes about specific ways I could help without sacrificing myself. When I hung up, I felt slightly less panicked, but still completely lost about what to do. I opened my text messages and typed out a message to my mother with shaking fingers. I told her I would only consider helping if she agreed to my conditions. No comments about my body, or what I eat, or how I look. No comparisons to Jasmine or anyone else ever. And I absolutely would not stay at her house if I came. She texted back within 30 seconds agreeing to everything, which made my stomach drop. My mother never agreed to anything that easily unless she was desperate or planning something. I tried calling Ethan's cell phone next, even though it was the middle of the night. It went straight to voicemail and his message sounded weak and tired. I left him a message telling him I loved him and wanted to help if he'd let me. I said I understood what he was going through because I'd been there too. I wondered if his phone was even charged, or if he had the energy to check messages. At 4 a.m., Apollonia found me crying on the couch with my laptop open to airline websites. She made me chamomile tea without asking any questions and sat down next to me. I explained everything about Ethan and showed her the photo, and she gasped when she saw it. She got a notepad and helped me make a list of what I could realistically do to help. We wrote down things like finding treatment centers and getting him medical help and setting up support. She reminded me that I couldn't save him if it meant destroying myself in the process. We sat there until the sun came up making plans and backup plans. After Apollonia left for her morning class, I spent hours researching eating disorder treatment centers near my hometown. I found 3 residential programs and 2 outpatient clinics within driving distance of my mother's house. Then I found a hospital with a special unit for medical stabilization of severe malnutrition cases. They had a whole team of doctors who specialized in refeeding syndrome and cardiac complications from starvation. I bookmarked everything and made a spreadsheet with contact numbers and insurance information. My therapist had an opening at noon and fit me in for an emergency session. We spent the whole hour creating a detailed safety plan for if I went back. She helped me write down specific phrases I could use to set boundaries with my mother. Things like, "I need to step away now," and "that topic is not up for discussion." We identified warning signs that would mean I needed to leave immediately, if I started restricting food, or if my mother made any body comments, or if I felt unsafe. We practiced the phrases out loud until they felt natural to say. She also gave me a list of therapists in my hometown who could see me if I needed support. That afternoon, I finally decided to book a flight for the next morning. My hands shook as I entered my credit card information, knowing this would use most of my savings. I found a hotel near the hospital and booked 3 nights to start. It was 20 minutes from my mother's house, but far enough that she couldn't just show up. I made sure it had a kitchenette so I could prepare my own safe meals. I tried calling my father next to get Ethan's insurance information for potential treatment. He didn't answer, which wasn't surprising since he'd basically disappeared after leaving my mother. I left a voicemail that was probably too angry, asking how he could abandon his sick son. I said Ethan needed medical help, and the least he could do was provide insurance information. I hung up feeling furious at his weakness all over again. That night, I started packing and deliberately left my scale in the bathroom. It was a test for myself to see if I could handle being without it. I packed protein bars and crackers and other safe foods I knew I could eat. I grabbed comfortable clothes and my phone charger and headphones for the plane. I kept the packing light with just one carry-on bag and a backpack. As I zipped up the bag, I felt scared but also weirdly determined to help Ethan. Tomorrow morning, I would get on that plane and face everything I'd run from. The next morning came too fast, and I was sitting in the airport typing out a long text to my mother with shaking hands. I told her she could only update me about Ethan through text messages, and she couldn't show up at my hotel. Any talks about medical stuff had to have doctors or nurses there too. She sent back 5 crying face emojis and said okay, which made me more nervous than if she'd fought me. The boarding call came and I grabbed my bag and got in line with everyone else heading to my hometown. My seat was in the middle and I squeezed between a businessman and a college kid who both ignored me completely. When we took off, I watched Oregon disappear below and felt my stomach drop knowing what was waiting for me. The flight attendant came by with the snack cart and asked if I wanted pretzels or cookies. I said pretzels before I could think about it, and she handed me the little silver bag. I stared at it for a full minute, hearing my mother's voice counting 110 calories per serving. My hands opened the bag anyway, and I put one pretzel in my mouth and chewed slowly. The salt tasted good, and I ate another one and then another, using the breathing my therapist taught me. Count to 4 breathing in and hold for 4, and breathe out for 4, and hold for 4. I finished the whole bag and kept it down even though my brain was screaming at me about the calories. The plane landed and I walked through the airport I'd run through 2 years ago, going the other direction. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, like the whole place had shrunk while I was gone. I ordered an Uber and waited outside in the humid air that Oregon never had. The driver was an older guy who didn't try to talk, which was perfect, because I couldn't have made conversation anyway. We drove past my old high school and I saw they'd painted it blue instead of the ugly beige it used to be. Then we passed the strip mall with the ballet studio where Jasmine took classes, and my mother would drag me to watch. The studio was gone and replaced with a phone repair shop, which felt weirdly satisfying. My chest got tighter as we turned onto familiar streets, getting closer to the house I swore I'd never see again. The driver pulled up and I handed him cash and grabbed my bag and stood on the sidewalk looking at the house. Nothing had changed except the garden was dead and the paint was peeling on the shutters. I walked up the driveway and knocked instead of using my old key that I'd thrown away. My mother opened the door and I saw Ethan behind her and had to grab the door frame because he looked so much worse than the photo. His clothes hung off him like he was made of wire hangers and his eyes were huge in his face. He wouldn't look at me and just stared at the floor while my mother started talking immediately. She said I looked healthy, but the way she said it meant fat, and then she started saying this was all my fault for leaving. I cut her off and told Ethan we were going to get lunch and turned around before she could answer. He followed me outside and we started walking down the street in silence. I asked if he wanted to get burgers at the place we used to go and he shook his head saying his stomach hurt too much. We kept walking and made it maybe halfway down the block before he had to sit down on someone's lawn. His face was gray and he was breathing hard like he'd run a mile instead of walking 100 feet. I sat next to him and asked if he was okay, and he nodded, but I could see he was lying. He tried to stand up and fell back down, and his lips looked blue like he wasn't getting enough oxygen. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 while my mother came running down the street screaming at me not to embarrass the family. I told the dispatcher my brother was 17 and weighed 89 pounds and had an eating disorder and couldn't stand up. She said they were sending help right away, and to keep him sitting up and talking if possible. My mother was yelling that I was making everything worse and the neighbors were watching, but I ignored her. The ambulance came fast with lights flashing and 2 paramedics jumped out with their bags. They took his blood pressure and pulse and one of them looked at the other with this expression that scared me. They said his vitals were really low and he needed to go to the hospital right now. My mother insisted on riding in the ambulance, which was fine because I needed space from her anyway. I got in my rental car and followed them to the hospital, trying not to think about how small Ethan looked on the stretcher. At the ER, they took him straight back and a doctor came out after about 20 minutes. He introduced himself as Dr. Cyrus Trevino and explained that Ethan's heart rate was 32 and his blood pressure was dangerously low. He said Ethan was at risk for something called refeeding syndrome, which could kill him if they fed him too fast. They needed to start IV fluids really carefully and monitor his heart, and he'd need to stay for at least a week. My mother started telling everyone that Ethan just had a stomach bug and didn't need all this fuss. I waited until she went to the bathroom and pulled the nurse aside and told her the real story. I explained how Ethan had been losing weight for months and my mother had encouraged it, and he was copying what I did when I lived there. The nurse wrote it all down and said she'd make sure the team knew the real situation. Dr. Trevino came back 10 minutes later with a clipboard and started asking about emergency contacts while explaining how they'd slowly increase Ethan's calories over the next few days to avoid his organs shutting down. I wrote down my father's cell number even though he hadn't answered my calls and added my own Oregon number, making sure to tell him I was only here temporarily and would be going back once Ethan was stable. The nurse brought over a stack of forms about Ethan's medical history and asked if I could help fill them out since my mother kept insisting nothing was wrong. I sat in the waiting room with a pen and started writing down everything I remembered, starting with how my mother had controlled our food since we were little kids, the way she'd measure portions and count calories for us, how she'd punish weight gain with smaller meals. My hands shook as I wrote dates and examples, trying to keep my emotions out of it and just stick to facts the doctors could use. I documented the weekly weigh-ins, the comparisons to other kids, the way she'd praise us for skipping meals, all of it going back years. The forms took almost an hour to complete, and I handed them back to the nurse who read through them quickly and nodded like she'd seen this before. My mother was still in Ethan's room, so I slipped out to find my rental car and drove to the hotel I'd booked online, a cheap place about 10 minutes from the hospital. The room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning products, but at least it was away from my mother's house. I dropped my bag on the bed and realized I hadn't eaten anything since the plain pretzels that morning. The vending machine in the hallway had chips and candy bars, and I bought a granola bar and a small bag of pretzels, forcing myself to eat them even though being back here made my stomach tight with the old need to restrict. I followed the meal plan my therapist had given me, eating the whole granola bar in small bites while sitting on the hotel bed and watching some mindless TV show. Sleep came in pieces that night, waking up every hour thinking about Ethan hooked up to those machines. The next morning, I got to the hospital early for rounds and found Ethan barely able to keep his eyes open while the medical team checked his vitals. Dr. Trevino explained to my mother and me that Ethan needed at least 48 hours of careful refeeding before they could even evaluate his mental state properly because his brain wasn't getting enough nutrients to function normally. The team was kind, but serious about how dangerous his condition was, using words like critical and life-threatening while my mother stood there with her arms crossed. A woman in a navy blazer knocked on the door frame and introduced herself as Flavia Marr, the hospital social worker who handled cases involving eating disorders and family dynamics. She had this calm way of talking that made it clear she'd dealt with situations like ours before, recognizing the patterns immediately when she looked between my mother and me. Flavia started explaining treatment options and family resources, pulling out brochures for residential programs and support groups, while my mother huffed and rolled her eyes. I stepped out to use the bathroom and my mother followed me into the hallway, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave marks. She hissed that this was all my fault, that Ethan was fine until I left and taught him not to eat with my drama and attention-seeking. Her face was inches from mine and I could smell her coffee breath as she blamed me for destroying her perfect son. I pulled my arm away and walked straight to the nurse's station without saying anything, standing there next to the desk until she finally stopped following me and went back to Ethan's room. The nurses pretended not to notice, but one of them gave me a small nod like she understood. Later that afternoon, I found Flavia in her office down the hall and told her I couldn't have any discussions with my mother without hospital staff present for my own safety. She immediately understood and started making notes, saying she'd arrange for all family meetings to be supervised and documented from now on. My phone buzzed with a text from my father finally responding to my dozen messages with the insurance policy number and group ID, but saying he couldn't come to the hospital because of an important work project. I wanted to throw my phone at the wall, but instead I just forwarded the information to Flavia, so she could start the authorization process for Ethan's treatment. That evening, Ethan was awake for about 15 minutes, and I sat next to his bed while we talked about the new Zelda game, and which Pokemon were strongest, anything except food or family or why he was here. He seemed relieved to have a normal conversation, and asked if I could bring his Nintendo Switch from the house, so he'd have something to do. I promised I'd get it tomorrow, even though going back to that house made my skin crawl. The next day, my mother started telling Dr. Trevino that Ethan just needed some vitamins and fresh air, not all this psychiatric nonsense, insisting he was just going through a phase. Dr. Trevino stayed calm but firm, explaining that eating disorders were serious mental illnesses requiring comprehensive treatment, including therapy and nutritional rehabilitation, not character flaws or phases that kids grew out of. He showed her Ethan's lab results and vital signs, pointing out the dangerous levels that proved this was a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention. My mother kept arguing, but I walked away to get some air and ended up in the hospital cafeteria. The lunch rush was starting, and I watched the kitchen staff weighing portions on little scales behind the counter. My chest got tight seeing them measure out exact amounts of mashed potatoes and green beans. The room started spinning, and I couldn't breathe right, so I rushed outside to the parking lot. I called Apollonia with shaking hands, and she picked up on the second ring. She talked me through the breathing exercises we'd practiced before I left Oregon. Count to 4 breathing in, hold for 4, out for 4, she kept saying until my heart stopped racing. After 20 minutes, I could think straight again and went back inside. Flavia found me in the waiting area with 3 glossy brochures spread across her clipboard. She explained each residential program while my mother sat there with her arms crossed. The first place was 2 hours away and focused on medical stabilization before therapy. The second one had a family program, but cost way more than insurance would cover. The third one had an opening in 2 weeks and looked like our best shot. Flavia said she'd start the paperwork if we wanted to move forward with applications. My mother complained about the distance, but I ignored her and asked about visiting policies. Later that afternoon, the treatment team asked for a family history, so I sat in an empty conference room with a yellow legal pad. I wrote down everything starting with my 5th birthday and the 3 bites of cake, the scale checks every morning before school, the way Mom would pinch our stomachs at the dinner table, how she'd make us stand naked in front of the mirror and point out problem areas, the time she locked the fridge when I was 10 because I'd gained 2 pounds, every detail that might help them understand why Ethan ended up here. My hand cramped from writing, but I kept going for over an hour. When I went back to Ethan's room, he was awake but staring at the ceiling. He whispered that the nurse made him drink some nutrition shake earlier. He said he could feel every calorie spreading through his body, making him huge like a balloon. His voice was so quiet I had to lean close to hear him. I told him I understood because the fear feels real even when our brains are lying to us. I didn't try to convince him he was wrong because I knew that wouldn't help. The next morning, they needed to do blood work and vitals again. Ethan started crying when the nurse came in with her cart. I asked if I could stay with him, and she said that was fine. He grabbed my hand so hard it hurt when she put the blood pressure cuff on. His arm was so thin the pediatric cuff was still too big. The nurse had to wrap it twice to get a reading. When she left, I stayed sitting on the edge of his bed holding his hand. He looked less like my brother, and more like those pictures of sick kids in charity commercials. That afternoon, my mother started yelling at the nurse's station about the bills piling up. She said Ethan could recover at home once he could walk without falling over. The psychiatrist came out and explained calmly that discharge wasn't just about walking. Ethan needed medical clearance and a safe discharge plan with proper support. She said sending him home now would be dangerous and possibly fatal. My mother huffed and said the doctor was being dramatic, but she stopped arguing. That evening, I had my regular phone session with my therapist back in Oregon. We spent 40 minutes planning exactly what I'd say to my mother about boundaries. My therapist had me write down specific phrases and practice saying them out loud. She said I could stay strong for 15 minutes max before needing to leave the room. We went over my exit strategy 3 times until I had it memorized. The next morning, Flavia arranged a family meeting in her office down the hall. My mother came in complaining about missing work for this nonsense. Flavia sat between us with her notebook open and pen ready. I took a deep breath and said I'd help coordinate Ethan's treatment from Oregon, but only if my mother agreed to family therapy and stopped all comments about food and bodies. My mother started crying about how hard her life had been since Dad left. She said nobody understood the sacrifices she'd made for us kids. I kept my hands folded and repeated my conditions without responding to her tears. She shifted tactics and brought up Rita's daughter who just got engaged to a doctor. She said Jasmine appreciated everything Rita did for her, unlike some daughters. She looked right at me when she said it, but I didn't take the bait. I just repeated that my offer stood if she wanted my help with Ethan's care. Flavia wrote everything down and said she'd document our agreement for the treatment team. Dr. Trevino came by that afternoon with Ethan's latest lab results on his tablet. He showed us the numbers improving slowly, but said this would take months, not weeks. Ethan's potassium was better, but still below normal range. His heart rate was more stable, but still too low for discharge. Ethan actually looked relieved when the doctor said months because at least there was a plan. The next morning, Ethan was awake when I got to his room and he looked at me with tears already forming in his eyes. He started telling me how after I left, Mom kept saying he was such a good boy when he didn't finish his dinner. She'd smile and say he was finally learning control like his sister did. We both ended up crying and I grabbed his hand and told him none of this was his fault, because we were both just kids trying to survive in that house. I kept holding his hand while the nurse came in to check his IV, and realized I couldn't stay here much longer without falling back into old habits myself. Later that morning, I found Flavia in her office and told her I needed to go back to Oregon once we got Ethan into a program, because being here was making me want to restrict again. She nodded and said that was actually the healthiest choice for everyone involved, and we could coordinate his care long distance. We spent the next 2 hours filling out applications for the residential program that had an opening in 2 weeks. Flavia helped me write down all of Ethan's medical information, while I filled in the family history sections trying not to cry. She called the admissions coordinator and put them on speaker, so we could answer questions together. We needed letters from the treatment team, so Flavia walked me down to find Dr. Trevino, who was doing rounds. He said he'd write the recommendation right after he finished with patients, and would emphasize the medical necessity. The insurance paperwork was a nightmare with questions about previous treatments and family medical history that made my hands shake. My phone rang while we were working, and it was my father finally calling back after 3 days of messages. He said he'd pay whatever insurance wouldn't cover, but he couldn't come see Ethan because it was too painful for him. I wanted to scream at him about being a coward, but I just asked for his credit card information and employer details for the financial forms. That afternoon, my mother cornered me in the hallway and asked me to move back home to help take care of Ethan after treatment. She said the family needed me and grabbed my arm when I tried to walk away. I pulled free and told her clearly that I would never live in that house again, but I'd help coordinate his care from Oregon. She started crying about how I was abandoning them again, but I just walked to the nurse's station and stood there until she left. The next day, Ethan had to sign paperwork allowing me to get updates about his treatment and listing me as an emergency contact. His hand shook so bad the nurse had to help steady it, but he managed to sign everything. It was the first real decision he'd made about his own care, and I felt proud watching him take that small step. Dr. Trevino came by that afternoon to explain what Ethan needed before he could go to residential treatment. He pulled up a chair and told us Ethan needed stable vital signs for at least 48 hours and had to be taking nutrition by mouth without vomiting. He also couldn't have any acute medical problems that needed hospital care like heart issues or severe dehydration. Ethan nodded along, looking scared, but like he was trying to understand what getting better actually meant. That night, back at my hotel, I caught myself staring at my stomach in the bathroom mirror and realized I'd only eaten an apple all day. My hands were shaking as I called Apollonia back in Oregon and told her what was happening. She stayed on the phone while I forced myself to eat crackers from the vending machine, even though every bite felt wrong. We talked for an hour about random stuff from her classes while I ate slowly and tried not to count calories. The next morning, there was an educational session about eating disorders for families, and my mother actually showed up. I watched from the doorway as the counselor explained how eating disorders were real illnesses, not choices or attention-seeking. My mother sat in the front row taking notes, and only interrupted twice to ask questions instead of her usual arguing. She even stayed quiet when another parent talked about their child's recovery taking years, not weeks. I couldn't believe she was actually listening, but maybe she was starting to understand this was serious. That afternoon was huge because Ethan managed to drink an entire nutrition shake without throwing up. The nurses didn't make a big deal about it, but I saw them smile at each other when he finished. He still looked scared holding the empty bottle, but there was something different in his eyes, like maybe he wanted to fight this thing. His hands were steadier and his lips weren't as blue as they'd been even 2 days ago. The psychiatrist came by and said if he could keep doing this for another day, they could start planning his transfer to residential. Ethan asked if I'd visit him there, and I promised I would fly back from Oregon at least once during his first month. My mother started to say something about me abandoning the family again, but then stopped herself and just nodded. 3 days later, Flavia's phone rang while we were going over discharge paperwork, and she put it on speaker so I could hear. The residential facility had a bed opening in exactly 5 days if Ethan could get medical clearance by then. I watched Flavia pull out form after form, checking boxes and signing where she needed to, while I filled out family history sections with shaking hands. The insurance rep on the phone kept asking for codes and dates, and I scrambled through my notebook to find everything they needed. After 40 minutes of back and forth, they approved 30 days of treatment with possible extensions based on medical need. Ethan was sleeping when we told him, but he nodded and squeezed my hand, which was more response than we'd gotten in days. The next morning, my mother found me in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a bagel I couldn't bring myself to eat. She sat down across from me and started talking about how maybe she'd been too hard on us kids sometimes, how she only wanted us to be happy and successful. I listened to her words but watched her hands, the way she kept glancing at my untouched food, the little frown when she noticed I'd gained weight since arriving. I told her I appreciated her trying to understand, and then excused myself to go check on Ethan because I knew she wasn't ready for real change yet. That afternoon, I used the hospital computer to book my flight back to Oregon for the day after Ethan would transfer to the facility. Flavia helped me set up a schedule where she'd send me weekly updates about his progress, and I could video call during family therapy sessions if needed. We created a whole communication plan with backup contacts and emergency protocols because I needed to know I could help from a distance without drowning in this place. The morning of Ethan's transfer, 2 staff members from the residential facility came to pick him up, and I helped him pack his few allowed items into a plastic bin. He could barely walk to the transport van, but he managed it, and I hugged him carefully before they drove away. My own flight left 6 hours later, and I spent the whole time staring out the window trying not to count how many peanuts were in the snack bag. Landing in Oregon felt like being able to breathe again, and Apollonia picked me up from the airport with a bag of my safe foods and no questions about how I looked. My therapist had cleared her schedule for an emergency session the next day, where I sat on her couch and talked for 90 minutes straight about everything that had happened. She helped me adjust my meal plan, and we made a new recovery schedule that accounted for how triggered I'd been by going home. We practiced grounding exercises, and she reminded me over and over that helping Ethan didn't mean sacrificing my own progress. 3 days after getting back, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Ethan writing from the facility's phone during free time. He'd typed out that he was scared, but they had therapy dogs that came twice a week. It was the first normal message he'd sent in months, not about food or weight or being too big, just about dogs. I sat on my bathroom floor crying with relief that he'd made it there, and was maybe starting to see there could be more to life than destroying himself. A week later, my mother sent an email saying she'd found an online support group for parents of kids with eating disorders and was attending meetings 3 times a week. She asked if we could reduce our phone calls so she could focus on the program work, which shocked me because she'd never admitted needing help before. I wanted to be suspicious, but Flavia confirmed my mother had been asking good questions during family education sessions, taking notes and actually listening to other parents share their mistakes. Back in my apartment, I made myself reduce my daily weigh-ins to just twice a week, even though the urge was stronger after everything with Ethan. Apollonia sat with me during meals when I needed support, not saying anything about the food, just being there while I worked through the anxiety of eating regularly. My recovery wasn't perfect, and some days I still restricted without meaning to, but I wasn't spiraling into full relapse, which felt huge considering everything. I kept thinking about how I hadn't fixed our broken family or erased all the damage from our childhood, but maybe I'd helped crack the cycle just enough for Ethan to have a chance. We were all in different stages of dealing with the mess my mother had created, her and her support group, Ethan in treatment, me back in therapy, and maybe that was the most realistic outcome we could get. None of us were okay yet, but we were all trying in our own ways to climb out of the hole we'd been raised in, and that had to count for something even if it wasn't the neat resolution people probably wanted to hear. Well, that's gonna do it for now. Thanks for just being here and exploring all these curious details with me. Always enjoy sharing this time with you. Subscribe for more content like this.